right, and we are recording. Hi, everyone. My name's Sasha Hodder. We're on the HodlCast. Today is October 4th, and we're at the Crypto Springs Conference, and I have AML Ninja, Compliance Ninja, Amber Scott with us. She's the founder of Canada's premier compliance company for everything Bitcoin called Outlier Canada. So maybe, Amber, you can give us a little background on how you got involved in Bitcoin and what excites you about this space, and then we'll get into the differences of Canada and US's KYC regulations.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. So a few years ago, a friend of mine called me up and said, hey, I'm starting to do payment processing for these Bitcoin companies. And I need to update my risk assessment. Can you help me do that work? I was like, sure, no problem. I've read about Bitcoin and Wired. I've never used it. So can you pay my retainer in Bitcoin? Because I don't understand stuff until I play with it, right?
And that's so true about Bitcoin. Until you do a transaction, it's like you don't know what you're talking about.
You don't get it.
Yeah.
And so like on a Thursday, he was like, yeah, I'm going to send you some articles. I need you to read them. I need you to spend some time figuring out wallet and security because it's not going to be like other things that you know about. And so I ended up spending a weekend just diving into it, kind of taking some people off because I bailed on all my plans.
That's everyone when they get into Bitcoin does that.
It's like falling in love, right?
Yeah.
Like I was just like, oh, Bitcoin and coffee, and that was my whole weekend. And so by Monday I had this wallet, and everyone is always like, did you keep your Bitcoin? No, I transacted. I had to understand transactions. So at the point where Bitcoin went from $100 to $900, I was very excited. I bought a gift for one of my partners. It was a tablet that promptly got left on a plane that today would be like a $10,000 tablet. So,
better than pizza.
Yeah, there's the story of my first Bitcoin. I like at least the pizza, they got to enjoy it.
Yeah, true. Yeah, it sucks thinking back of all the money. I didn't buy that much stuff with Bitcoin, but a few things, like I bought some mugs with it or a few things on Overstock, and it's like you look at it. Was that worth it? No. Or the flights.
I disagree with that because I think some of those things, like if no one was using it, if no one was doing anything with Bitcoin, if no one was making transactions, it wouldn't be interesting to build on. It wouldn't be interesting to start having some of these scaling solutions that we have. Like if no one wanted to transact with Bitcoin, Lightning would be pointless. And I think Lightning is awesome.
Very true.
So your transactions contributed to that.
Yes, glad to contribute. And we heard from Miss Stark this morning. She did a great, really. And for putting this whole conference together in this beautiful location you can see behind us. And I guess now onto the fun stuff. So I recently wrote a little blog article on some of the U.S. KYC issues, and what I'm seeing, or just I guess to give an overview of the American way, is we have a national set of rules through FinCEN where anyone that is a money service business has to register with FinCEN, and the way they determine who's a money service business is they've broken it down into 3 levels. You're either a user, an administrator, and or an exchanger. A user, we kind of discussed earlier, it would be like me and Amber doing a transaction. We're not registered as a business. We're not in the business of administering or issuing tokens, redeeming tokens.
We haven't advertised that you can come to us to make an exchange.
So for that kind of transaction, we're not required to do anything with FinCEN, and we can interact however we want. But as soon as we would get into being an administrator or an exchanger, so that would be, you actually had a really good analogy of Tether and Bitfinex for it. So maybe.
So the way that it's written, for instance, Tether, they issue a coin, so they would be the issuer. You can actually go back to them and trade your Tether for, a US dollar. So that would make them an administrator. Whereas if you went to Bitfinex and exchange Tether for Bitcoin, that's an exchange transaction.
Exactly. So yeah, anytime you're exchanging cash for crypto or crypto for crypto, so that I think is also an important distinction, because some people think as long as you're working over in the crypto world, exchanging one token for another isn't the same. It only triggers if you were to move cash into a coin, but that's not true. Any coin that you move against each other is an exchange. So
do you know the root of that, where that came from?
I mean, there was a lot of confusion around taxes on the same idea, but what?
Yeah, so the Financial Action Task Force, like the FATF, issued a paper like really early on, I think in 2014 or 2015, where they said that people should focus in terms of regulation on on-off ramps. And so what they meant by that was fiat to crypto or crypto to fiat.
Yeah.
So early on, before there was more regulatory clarity, I think that pretty much everyone thought that that would really be the focus. So that if you were doing crypto to fiat, you would be regulated. And if you were doing crypto to crypto, you wouldn't be. And I certainly had decks where I espoused that notion, right? Where I was talking about that. And in the actual regulations, the way that they've been written, the way that they've been interpreted by regulators, it's come out that that's actually not the case. I'm sorry, I was wrong.
You and everyone else, because we were listening to one thing, and that's the problem in crypto, as we were saying, you know, there's so much gray, or not even just gray, but just actual contradicting information coming out from different regulators. Like the one aspect saying, you know, the taxes, saying we could do like kind exchanges before that, or everyone thinking that and then turning out that you can't. Or with these exchanges, you know, at one point they're saying that all ICO issuers need to be considered an administrator and register with FinCEN, and then there's been other guidance that say you probably don't, or it's
it depends.
Yeah.
And I think if you think that you might be captured, get certainty, do your due diligence, either get that certainty if you can from the regulator directly, so by saying here's the thing that we want to do, do we need to comply with this, yes or no? And if you can't get that from them directly, get a good legal position, get it documented, pay for it, get it in writing, because you can always point back at that later and say, well, here's the thing that we were relying on. Don't rely on just word of mouth. Don't rely on, I talked to my buddy and they did something similar and it seems to be reasonable.
That's
it's not great due diligence.
I get so many clients coming into me saying, well, my friend did it this way and they didn't get in trouble. And I was like, well, not yet, but they might. Or, you
that's
just
hard
can't.
too, because some of these investigations take years. So you might hear from a regulator years later. And I mean, some of these cases that we've seen with the SEC, they've actually said you have a choice. You can put on an orange jumpsuit or you can give the money back.
Yeah.
And so we've seen a few cases where businesses have actually given the money back.
Well, I would quickly give the money back before I go to jail too. Yeah.
We all like freedom.
Money doesn't do you much good in jail. So what's the Canadian situation? So that, I guess maybe to finish off the US one, so if you're one of those exchangers or administrators, you're considered a money transmitter and you have to file Form 107 with FinCEN, which is it's a one-page form. It's not very hard to, I mean, you should probably get an attorney or compliance officer to do it, but you file this form. You have to download Internet Explorer. That's the only type of internet FinCEN will deal with. Yeah, that was the hardest part of the whole process for me, was getting the Internet Explorer to work. But but after that, then you have to, anyone that's showing up on an OFAC list, you can't do business with them, and any transactions over $5,000 or that seem suspicious, you have to file a SAR. And then you have to look at the state-by-state analysis too. So some states like New York have special, the BIT license that you need to do any kind of money transmission there. But yeah.
Yeah, the state-by-state thing is really interesting to me. So from a Canadian perspective, we have one province that has a different regime for money services businesses.
Let me guess, Quebec?
It's Quebec. Vive la France! Yes, Quebec.
Tell me.
So Quebec has their own regime where you need to do a separate licensing with the Autorité des marchés financiers. There is no translation for that name, which is very telling. So if you're planning on doing business in Quebec, you also need a respondent that's located in the province of Quebec, and it's much better if they speak French. Just in terms of dealing with the regulator. That said, they do have a mandate to be bilingual, so you could slog your way through it in English as well. Otherwise, Canada just has a federal regime from an anti-money laundering perspective, but crypto isn't covered yet. So we had proposed regulation in June. It looks very similar to the US regulation because we're both FATF members, so it's sort of membership in a club, and to be a member of that club, you have to do things a certain way.
Yeah.
So our regulation is going to look similar, at least at a macro level, and then on that micro, very detailed level, there's some differences in terms of how you identify people, in terms of what KYC information
what
you have to
information will Canada require to collect?
So really similar. One of the big differences between Canada and the US is with a social insurance number. We call it in Canada a social security number. You call it in America. So in America, you're required to collect it in a bunch of instances. In Canada, you actually cannot collect it.
Because it's too dangerous to hold,
you're prohibited unless you're doing very certain types of accounts. So if you're doing like special tax class, like tax registered, tax exempt assets, then you have to collect that information. For most things, you would not collect that at all. In fact, you'd be prohibited from collecting it. So money service businesses would not collect that type of information. Where I think that's going to get interesting in the crypto space is when we actually start having funds, so registered funds that can be held as part of an RSP, which is like a Canadian 401k. And in those cases,
they'll need that information to charge their taxes. Yeah. And I think Europe has a lot of privacy laws where you can't collect the passport data either. So passport and their equivalent of a social security or insurance, you're not allowed collecting for certain things.
I think that we're going to see a massive shift in terms of what's collected and how it's collected. So one of the most fascinating conversations that I had recently that I won't attribute, but had someone referring to Equifax and TransUnion data as essentially toxic byproducts of credit scoring. And one of the things that really hit home for me in that conversation is that our governments are well aware that there are data honeypots, that those honeypots are endangering citizens, that there are, that it's not necessarily the best model to have a number of businesses just collecting and holding on to and not really knowing how to effectively secure this data. And that there are specific parties that should really be stewards of identity, if you will, and how much of things you reveal needs to be more controlled.
So maybe so the stewards of the identity would have like specialization in securely holding that data, and then they could verify it to someone else. Or
well, exactly. And the way that this conversation went was that the stewards of identity in certain respects would be government, so your passport issuers, your driver's license issuers, but a company shouldn't necessarily be able to pull in all of that information. They should be able to ping to say, is this valid? Is this verifiable? And do a verification that doesn't require them to hold all of the personal identity data,
like have a token
within their
to
own
it.
system.
Yeah.
So I think that there's definitely a lot of thought going into that, and that probably over the next decade we're going to see a big shift in how that's done, in terms of how that's administered, in terms of what's required in that regard.
Well, I started recently doing some counterparty transactions. It's just like where people would buy and sell those rare Pepes, or there's this Bitcoin game. But they have a way to sign a transaction so that you just copy and paste one thing from one screen to another screen, and it looks like a Bitcoin address. Well, actually, I think it is a Bitcoin address on Counterparty. But all you do is sign that transaction, and it verifies all the information. So I think that would, it's not user-friendly for the mass market of individuals, but if there's a way to do that, we could be doing that to verify KYC as well. Like if all your information was stored by the government and you just had to put in like
you had to sign it in whatever way, and that ability to sign or that particular key could be revoked if you lost it, if it was compromised. That's definitely I think the way that we're heading. And you're right, user friendliness is a bit of an obstacle for that right now, but I think there are some really brilliant minds that have started to bend themselves to UX. Like we certainly saw that in some of the earlier talks at this conference.
Amber did a great job outlining. Yeah, she did. She was really good this morning. Another Amber. We got a lot of smart Ambers at this conference.
There's a secret society. We're all awesome.
And I guess that kind of sums it up. So Canada, you can do most, like a Bitcoin ATM, you don't need to register anywhere yet, but you probably will coming up soon.
You will. And I think that we'll see that in probably the first half of 2019, when the law comes into effect in Canada, because it is updated regulation. So it's kind of different in America. What happened is that FinCEN had just said, hey, we're applying existing legislation. We think it applies to these types of transactions. In Canada, initially we said it doesn't apply, but we're going to rewrite the regulation so that it does apply. So when that new regulation is published, there's going to be a transition period for companies to get compliant. So if you're doing business in Canada, pay attention to it, but don't panic. You'll have at least a year of runway to get compliant.
How Canadian of them to like, you know, it is just, it seems like a much more civilized approach to be like, okay, here's going to be the rules. We're going to think about it. We're going to spend a couple years drafting it, making it apply properly. I think they were in talks with Andreas Antonopoulos back in 2014. So
yeah,
they've been considering
he spoke to the Senate Committee on Trade, Banking, and Finance.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a great talk.
I saw it live when it was or you know, on TV at the time, and I remember thinking, oh, Canada's gonna get it right. I love Andrea, but you know, then now they've come out with, you know, they're taking comments, as you said, and then giving. I think that's really nice to give companies a year to comply with this. And I think the difference is that here in America they have the Patriot Act, and they can and the Bank Secrecy Act, and they have a lot of regulations around countering terrorist financing, and it gives the government very broad power to oversee, you know, the vast majority of transactions. And that all started after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, when they put that Patriot Act in, and it's just kind of been expanding their power since then. So yeah, anyway, it is what it is. We gotta, these are the rules, and if you want to play, you gotta comply. So it's yeah. And where can people find you online?
OutlierCanada.com or at Outlier Canada on Twitter.
Nice. Okay. Well, thanks, Amber.
Thank you.
We'll go back and then enjoy the rest of the show. And thank you to Leah, lent me the Hodl hat for my HodlCast. And this is actually a Canadian company.
Hat.
Yeah, she told me she's going to send me their Twitter address, but it's, yeah, fun hat. Anyway, thanks.